Hello, welcome to Dav Chat. You might know me as a intermittent broadcaster with political commentary that originates in Australia, has lived in Singapore, and has moved to the United States. That's me. I've lived in 3 different countries in the last 4 years. I'd like to make America my home. There's a problem for me, and that is Uvalde, Buffalo, Parkland, Florida, Sandy Hook, Connecticut. My problem is that a strident and good at planning Republican group coalition of convenience between libertarian Republicans and theocratic Republicans who are keen to end the separation between church and state have become a potent political force, suppressing the wishes of the majority to be safe, to have sensible gun laws that make it necessary for a background safety check, that have appropriate red flag legislation at a federal level that would take military grade weapons out of the hands of civilians and de-incentivize these kind of notoriety chasing, dysfunctional, sociopathic mass murder occurrences that you get every few weeks at the moment, because the Buffalo mass shooting was less than 10 days ago. The shooting in a Taiwanese church in the United States less than a week ago. And of course, yesterday, when I believe the current body count is presumed to be 19 children who've lost their lives, who've lost their lives to the scourge of underregulated guns in the United States, and 2 teachers who've also lost their lives, together with 13 more admitted to hospital, 3 in critical condition, and a community devastated, and many children left with the psychological fallout of having witnessed the death of their friends and their classmates and had to step over bodies of their dead or injured classmates, which is something that's an overly heavy burden for children to have to cope with during their formative years. And it's all completely unacceptable, but we're pushing back against a status quo of either acceptance or despairing inevitability and fatalism. The people who've just think that massacred children is an acceptable price to pay for the freedom to buy weapons without restraint and without regulation, or with minimal regulation and restraint. And then people who are despairing and who have called their legislators or written to people or just desperately hoped that things would change, and are now in a situation that political scientist, I'll look up his name, but he described it as a political decay, when people become trapped in a self-perpetuating loop of no longer believing that the system is capable of serving their interests or the collective interests of their community, or just responding in any way, shape, or form adequately to the problems of a society. And in this society, it's privileging guns and privileging gun manufacturers and their interests and the interests of their consumers and their devoted clients, privileging those interests over the interests that normal people have in going about their daily lives without fearing a massacre, without fearing what might happen to their children at school, without having to promote unserious suggestions like teachers should all have weapons and should be trained in the art of exchanging gunfire with a shooter who could potentially be wearing body armor and would have the element of surprise on their side and would be motivated to maximize how many people they could take off guard and how many children at an elementary school or high school that they could slaughter in their quest for record-breaking levels of depravity. I mean, we can call it a mental illness, or we could just call it extreme levels of sociopathy, antisocial behavior, but somebody who decides to target a school full of elementary people with elementary children with military-grade weapons, that's somebody who's trying to rip apart a community with maximum impact, to devastate parents and devastate children. And look, lots of people around the world are even devastated just looking at America right now and not understanding the levels of political dysfunction or the pathway to that level of political dysfunction. I've studied it a little bit, and my synopsis of that dysfunction is that concessions were made when America was founded to wealthy slave owners living in smaller states or states with lower population. And those concessions were, let's have the Senate. Look, the filibuster wasn't part of the Constitution. The filibuster is a big obstacle to impactful problem solving, addressing problems in America as they arise. Everybody needs a functional government to address situations as they arise, whether they be climate change, gun proliferation, unsafe levels of gun proliferation. But America's government isn't functioning, and the malapportioned nature of the Senate, 2 senators for every state, regardless of how small the population is not a measure that uplifts the power of the little guy. If you're going to call the states a little guy, it's a measure that disenfranchises people from bigger population states. It disenfranchises the voters of California by making their votes count less relative to senators from other states. And that and the electoral college system are 2 potent contributors to rendering America's political system dysfunctional. That and the more recent adoption of the filibuster to try and obstruct civil rights advancements in American government, as well as the seeding of the idea in popular culture by Republican President Ronald Reagan and others in the Republican movement to inflict on the public the idea that big government is inherently bad and that small government is desirable, because that's an idea that's been promoted and circulated and amplified by people who want to contract civil rights, who want to roll back the civil rights that have been achieved in favor of advancing the interests of wealthy white men and wealthy white Christians to do whatever they please, and to have government funding given to segregated academies, to make people feel too unsafe to attend public schools, and instead to facilitate the development of newly segregated schools, to have more white-only schools because parents will be gifted vouchers from a Republican Party that is riding off a wave of parental dissatisfaction with what happens at public schools, and having the domestic terrorism impact, the emotional terrorism of school shootings that happen, and then the terror of having a Congress that is rendered impotent by the filibuster, by the Republican collective lack of will to advance gun legislation to secure the safety of innocent children and their teachers in a school environment. That confluence of circumstance is disheartening, and that disheartened, demoralized status is in itself a strategy for oppressing the American public. And the only way to counter that despair is to use anger, and not to just allow it to fester and make you numb, but to use your anger and your grief and your sorrow and your palpable rage to show that face to people who might vote Republican, to use that energy to try and mobilize people to vote for Democrats, but also to be honest about how you feel about that, because Republican voters who've told themselves that everything's fine have created an emotional igloo for themselves to leverage certain ideas to create emotional distance. I don't have to worry about my children because I'm going to choose to believe that this is a problem that just impacts other people, and it's not related to me, and it's not related to my decisions to vote for Republicans. It's not related to my decision to prop up and enable the kind of NRA-funded politicians who are perpetuating these harms against innocent American children. Because this is a problem that's localized to the United States. Lots of countries are highly developed, have enough money to buy video games and have enough technological development to engage with video games and have issues with mental health. America isn't the only highly developed nation in the world, but nowhere else other than the United States has this level of frequent massacres, frequently emotionally terrorizing and mass death causing gun violence massacres that are driven by people's ability to purchase guns at a young age. Republican Governor Abbott of Texas lowered the age of purchasing an assault rifle from 21 to 18, and the shooter in Uvalde bought the 2 assault rifles on his 18th birthday. So that's just my hope for the day, is that everybody dealing with the grief, sorrow, rage, and pain of knowing, of thinking about the children who died in agony, who died in pain, without their parents, without seeing their loved ones, in a place that they would have assumed was safe, and the agony of parents knowing that they couldn't hold their children or kiss them goodbye, that they died in pain without them, or that the children who survived are going to live with psychological torment, to have to return to school in the same environment in which they were terrorized and in which their friends were terrorized. For the teachers having to continue on to try to be professional, knowing that people are making the argument that if teachers had guns, they could have somehow stopped the shooter from killing anyone. And of course, that argument isn't sound, because armed police officers engaged the shooter in gunfire before he even got to the school and weren't able to stop him until he had already, using a weapon of military grade capacity, or close to military grade capacity, had rapidly killed 19 children, injured many more, some critically, and taken the lives of 2 teachers as well. So basically, I suggested in the title of this piece today that civility has its benefits, but we have to be prepared to trade in some of that civility and that status and that's let's all get along, to hold Republican voters accountable for the Republican politicians that they keep putting in office, who are sabotaging the health and safety of American children and their teachers, as well as everybody else who is potentially a victim of, whether now or in the future, of this pattern of repeat mass shootings, that everybody has to entertain those concerns that if they're in a public place, they could meet someone with an ambition to make a name for themselves as a mass murderer of renown, that there are people competing with themselves and with other previous mass murderers for the purpose of distinguishing themselves by killing more people than have been killed before. And that game and that pursuit has been legitimized by indulging the gun manufacturing sector in the United States, that it wasn't part of America's founding. The original army wasn't well supplied with weapons. It's been something promoted and indulged through a system of channeling donated funds to Republican candidates, and I presume even to Democratic Senators Joe Manchin and possibly Kristen Sinema, who have been 2 staunch defenders of that antiquated and obstructionist piece of procedural grift, which is the filibuster. Democratic Senators Manchin and Sinema need to be mitigated against by voting for more Democrats, because Democrats are introducing gun safety legislation, and they need your help. They need you to mobilize others. Christopher says hello and says, God bless you, Davina. Your capacity for caring is so needed. I hope it impacts the masses. Thank you. And by the way, hello. Thank you, Christopher. Trying to care. I think we have to be prepared to not hide from our grief. I went over and yelled at my neighbor yesterday, because he told me 2 weeks ago, when I mentioned that research had suggested that gun violence was now the leading cause of death of American children. That's right. It's outstripped motor vehicle accidents, falls, accidental poisonings, child abuse. It is gun violence that is killing the highest numbers of American children, higher than any other cause. And when I mentioned it to him, he said something very racist, which I presume is a talking point he gets from Tucker Carlson. because that man is toxic and is a conduit of toxic thinking to the millions of people who watch his toxic show. But my neighbor said to me, in dismissing my concerns about gun violence, said, it's just, and I apologize for repeating his racism, but he said, it's just black people shooting other black people. And I could see then that racism was a big block to stonewall action in the United States. If there are white people who don't believe that anything needs to be done because they're dismissing concerns about gun violence with this very inaccurate and racist argument that gun violence is constrained to only one demographic subset of America. It's not true, by the way. An average of 11.1 Americans, white Americans, die of gun violence per every 100,000 Americans each year. And the national average is 11.2, so very close to 11.1. And I'll bring up the statistics of that next time, but I've got to go right now. So thanks for being with me today. If you've watched and enjoyed the broadcast, it is a sad topic. My hearts go out to everybody affected in terms of the scale of loss for their own family if they've lost a child. My heart goes out to the children who have to live with those memories. My heart goes out to the children who are dealing with their injuries. And even if they receive excellent treatment in hospital, which will also be very costly potentially for their families, lead fragments that are too small to be operated on can sometimes stay in people's bodies and reduce their life expectancy and interfere with the functioning of their various bodily systems and their organs because of lead poisoning, because of the nature of bullet fragments that can't, that the risk-benefit column of removing them doesn't work. You could disrupt the body too much by getting out some borrowed fragments, or it wouldn't be possible. I just read that there are people years on dealing with the fallout effects of gun violence injuries, including lead gradually permeating their body from a bullet fragment remaining, or multiple bullet fragments remaining in their bodies. And as we know, lead interferes with cognitive development, can lead to developmental delays, can lead to a whole host of problems for people. So please consider joining a group like the Sandy Hook Promise. If you Google that, you'll find their website. If you Google Mums Demand Action, that's a group of women, but also parents and others, just concerned people who want to use their collective energies to put political pressure where it will matter, where it will make a difference and deliver results. Because after the last major massacre in an American school in Parkland, Florida, there was an effort to change state laws. And in fact, after Sandy Hook, there were efforts to change some state laws in different states, but there needs to be federal protections that cover all American states, particularly in the context of certain Republican governors, such as Republican Governor Greg Abbott, actively relaxing gun laws, actively making it easier for teenagers to buy assault weapons. As we saw, Beto O'Rourke stood up in Greg Abbott's press conference to say, this was entirely predictable, this is on you. And he modeled for all of us how we do need to throw aside those concerns about civility and constraint and getting along. And we need to penetrate the emotional igloo that Republicans and Republican voters have put around themselves to give themselves emotional distance from these real problems that we face in order to create energy for change, in order to dissipate their excuses and their rationalizations, the things that they use to help them live with themselves, even as they create circumstances that endanger children and that cause the death and the suffering and the torment of children and their parents and teachers and their families, because all these people have families. So many lives have been devastated from all of the shootings over the last 2 weeks and all of the hundreds of shootings that occur in the United States each year. They no longer even make the news unless the number of dead reach a certain point. So this number of dead, that's 19 children between the ages of 7 and 10, mostly I think in fourth grade, and 2 fourth grade teachers who died. If we don't use our response now to be honest, to show our feelings, for those of us who haven't rationalized that it's not our problem, for those of us who are still able to feel, who still have a scope of concern that includes American children, we have to model how to care again for people who've cut themselves off, and to apply shame to people who think they can just vote Republican and nobody's going to have an issue with it. We do have to make it an issue, and we do have to target our energy to mobilizing Democrats. So if somebody says to you, I can't be bothered to vote for the Democrats this year, in the midterms, I can't be bothered, I didn't have my student loan payments forgiven, what have they done for me lately, etc., you tell them. You use your capacity as one human to influence another. You show them how they are making you feel with their actions and their negligence and their choices that are facilitating the death of children. And that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for today, and talk to you again another time. You can see I'm a mom, and you can see all my children's toys in the background. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, Christopher.